Okay, we have started recording. Thank you everyone for being here. I have been doing a lot of screen sharing, but I'm never very fast at it. So just giving you a warning there. I'll be doing a lot of talking and stalling while I get this all set up. Here we go. Okay. Well, welcome. Today is March 1st and you're the Local Partners Roundtable, and we're meeting for the second time tonight. Thank you for being here. I'm Sophie McGinley. I'm an assistant planner with the City of Eugene Community Planning and Design team. I'm public engagement lead for the Middle Housing Project. And tonight I'm joined by Terry Harding, who's project manager, and Julie Fisher from Cogito, who is a consultant on this project. And here are our emails. I think you know them by now because I've sent you quite a lot, but you're always free to reach out to us. Tonight's meeting is scheduled to last for 2 hours, and here's a look at our agenda items. Terry and I will provide a project update and context for why we're having tonight's conversation. After time for questions, we'll have a 5-minute break and then spend the second half of the meeting having a roundtable discussion similar to last meeting's structure. We're all on Zoom a lot and it can be exhausting looking at a screen. So I wanted to begin this meeting with a grounding exercise. This exercise is called box breathing, and I'll guide us through 2 breaths that go along with the GIF. And I will wait for it to get to the top. Oh, we're gonna go. Okay, everybody breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Hold. Breathe in, hold, breathe out, and hold. Now that we're all zen, we're going to talk a little bit about Zoom housekeeping. This slide is just a reminder. I know you all are pretty adept at Zoom by now. The major things are to please keep yourself muted while not speaking. Please use the raise hand feature to put yourself in the queue, and to feel free to eat since it's dinner time and we're all humans. I also wanted to remind you of our shared agreements. So the roundtable structure already does this, but make sure everyone is able to contribute. Only one person speaks at a time. Please respect each other's opinions and perspectives. Be conscious of time, that's my job. And then speak from personal experience and the role that you serve. So I'd like to get us started with a quick round of introductions. And oh, I should have edited this. We just did this whole thing on Thursday too. I'll put this in the chat. Please introduce yourself and the local partner organization you serve on or are a part of, and then share a band or type of music you listen to in your formative years. Let's stop the share real quick. Put that in the chat once I edit this. And I'll go first. My name, as I said, is Sophie McGinley. I'm with the City of Eugene. And I'm taking too long to put this in the chat. And a band that I listened to during my formative years. I said the Smiths last time because of my dad, but this time I'll say that I know Shania Twain's entire discography. And I'll pass it to Terry.
Thanks, Sophie. Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner with the City of Eugene Planning Division and the project manager for House Bill 2001. And I think last time, I can't remember what I said, but I'm going to say The Cure, heavily influenced by my older brother. And he took me to a concert at the Oakland Coliseum that will be forever a formative experience. I'll pass it over to John.
Hi, everybody. John Belcher. I guess the hat I'm wearing here is the Neighborhood Leaders Council, or the River Road Community Organization. My band would be anything Eric Clapton, Cream, etc. And I will pass it on to Alexis.
Thanks, John. So Alexis Biddle, 1000 Friends of Oregon, and actually just moments ago, I joined the board of directors of Housing Land Advocates. So I guess I'm, although I wouldn't say I'm representing them in this, but they have an interest in House Bill 2001. And my band, I would have to go with the Beastie Boys. And I'll go ahead and pick on Karin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karin Knutson, architect and urban designer here locally and teach at UVO in the planning and architecture departments, as well as run my private practice. And I am the founding director of Better Housing Together, which is housing advocacy organization based here in Lane County, and a handful of our partners here on the call, which I always love to see. And formative band, the first international single that I purchased on compact disc, I'm trying to give as many details to my age of record buying, right? Which was like for a little Discman, Walkman, which was totally innovative in 9th grade, was a German single that was a B-side from a U2 album. And I thought it was so cool.
Let's go to Dan.
There we go. Dan Hill with the Arbor South companies, representing the development community, the design community, and also the Home Builders Association, as an active member of home builders for many, many decades now. My formative bands weren't really bands, they were country music singers. I was raised in Southern Idaho, and we didn't even have a rock station. So let's see, Charlie Pride, Patsy Cline, good grief, Oak Ridge Boys, those were all, that's all we could listen to. But then I became familiar with Elton John, and I loved Elton John's early music. So that would be my take.
How about Julie?
Yeah, I'm Julie Fisher. I'm with Cogito. I'm supporting the public involvement on this project. And I would just say, as a preteen, I bought my first record. Remember, this big was Peter Frampton. So that dates me. Let's see, who hasn't? Brittany.
Hey everybody, Brittany Quick-Warner. I am with the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce. I just fit a very quick run in between my two meetings, which is why I'm red-faced, and I logged on right at the exact moment. I guess I kind of go with Dan. So I'm from the Midwest, and I grew up listening to country. At least in my the years that I remember, I could decide which bands I listened to. Besides that, it was classic rock on my dad's radio. But mine was more in the Tim McGraw, Toby Keith, Kenny Chesney era of country. And I'll go with Seth.
Hi, I'm Seth Sadowski. I'm here representing We Can Tonight, Walkable Eugene Citizens Advisory Network, which is an advocacy organization in Eugene working on planning, zoning, development issues. And okay, let's see, developmental years, that can be, it's a pretty big range there, but I guess I will say a band I liked to listen to when I was young was REM. And then let's see, who hasn't gone? Ed.
Thank you. Ed McMahon, Executive Director of the Home Builders Association. And most of you may not know this band because I go way back. It's the Animals. Who's next?
Carmel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carmel Perez Snyder. I'm with AARP Oregon. I also sit on the board for Better Housing Together. And I would say probably the most formative, the band that I've listened to the most when I was growing up was the Beatles, because my mom was a huge, huge fan of the Beatles. And then, but then jump forward several years, I went back to college and became a huge fan of the Beastie Boys and Hall & Oates because I worked at a newspaper called The Man Eater.
Thank you all for indulging us in our fun icebreaker question. I love this one. So now we're going to stop having fun or continue having fun and talk about middle housing because I know you all are really excited about it. So let me share my screen again. Okay, so we'll get right to it. I'm going to go through a very high-level overview of the state rules, then we'll have time for some questions, and then Terry will review our approach and what we're calling levels of implementation. Since we last met in the fall, the Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted Oregon Administrative Rules, called OARs, as well as a model code to guide the compliance with House Bill 2001. These rules establish a floor, the minimum we must do to implement the bill. They do things like establish a cap on minimum lot size, parking, and design requirements. They also apply to new build middle housing, as well as conversion of single detached units to middle housing. And here are some highlights for what we're working with. As I mentioned, the OARs establish a cap on minimum lot size. So for triplexes, the largest minimum lot size we can allow is 5,000 square feet, and for a fourplex, 7,000 square feet. They also cap minimum on-site parking requirements that are correlated with lot size, but generally come out to one spot per unit. Then they establish that design standards can't be stricter than those in the model code or cause unreasonable cost and delay. Because of how the standards are written, nothing precludes the city from exceeding minimum standards, which is the basis for how we structured our public engagement and survey. And more on that soon. So a companion to the OARs, as I mentioned, is the model code. And cities can decide to adopt the entire model code or parts of the model code directly. The model code meets the OARs and is referenced in the OARs as a sort of ceiling for things like design standards, but it's different than the OARs. It's kind of like every rectangle is a square, but not every square is a rectangle. It also acts as an incentive to comply with the bill, because if we don't, by June 30th, 2022, the model code will automatically apply to the components that we haven't adopted. So here's an example of the differences between the OARs and the model code for the duplex model code. So this shows that for single dwelling standards, for design standards, there are certain things that apply in the model code, and then the OARs, the cities can apply the same or less restrictive standards to duplexes. One of the main difference is the definition of duplexes. So in the model code defines duplexes as being either attached or detached units. And for the OAR, cities can decide whether to allow detached units. And then another main difference is parking. So in the model code, does not require any minimum off-street parking for duplexes, but the OAR, we can require up to 2 off-street spaces. And that was, again, really high level, really quick, but the main gist is that last time we met with you, we were waiting for guidance from the state so that we understood what the parameters of implementation are. Now we know it, it's a floor, and then we're talking about levels of implementation. Any questions? And I can't see if you use the raise hand function, but if you just like wave your actual hand, I'll be able to see you. All right, I knew that you all were a knowledgeable bunch with this. So now I will, oh, I lied. I'm not going to pass it to Terry. I'm going to talk for a little bit longer. So as you know from the last meeting, we began conducting public engagement before knowing what the OARs would look like. We decided to ask folks like you about what should guide our implementation of the bill. We heard from you, the local partners roundtable, as well as the boards and commissions roundtable, equity roundtable, healthy democracy panel, and student outreach. These guiding values and principles were developed by people living in every ward, folks who are part of underrepresented communities, people of all ages, and more. Your input was critical to developing these. We ended up with 8, and they are as follows. And they're in no particular order. Equity and access to housing, broad dispersal of middle housing, housing options of all shapes and sizes, compact, efficient housing, sense of belonging, opportunities to build wealth, interconnectedness of housing solutions, and vibrant neighborhoods. We finalized the guiding values and principles right around the time LCDC adopted the OARs. The values and principles called for us to go beyond the minimum, think creatively, and focus on equity. And now Terry will discuss the approach that the guiding values and principles shaped and the levels of implementation we are seeking input on.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to be looking at my other screen where I have my notes, and then I'll look back to see if you have any questions. But as Sophie was saying, as we've done our outreach over the fall, we listened to several groups talk about their fears and hopes for this project, their fears and hopes around allowing housing in more places across Eugene. And we took some time to consider what came out of that process and what principles were suggested by Eugene residents to guide this work. We came up with this concept of levels of implementation based on the fact that all of the groups suggested that we view the minimum standards as a floor. So we didn't have rules yet, as Sophie said. So that's how we structured a series of questions in our survey around how to approach code writing for middle housing. We have kind of the blueprint in the OARs, the Oregon Administrative Rules, and we have parameters around many topics. But as far as the approach, we proposed or put together these 3 levels of implementation. At a minimum, middle housing must be allowed in many more places across Eugene. The rules are now finalized and they lay out the floor for compliance. But we do have the option of going beyond the minimum and encouraging middle housing, for example, by removing code barriers and increasing flexibility for development. We could also choose to go even further and incentivize certain types of housing by applying minimal regulations or applying bonuses and incentives, for example, where units are kept affordable or located within walking distance of transit. So this framework forms the basis for the survey that's out in the community and open until this Friday, March 5th. And you're welcome to take this survey, pass it around so that we have your voice added to our data that we'll be presenting to the Planning Commission next week. Now, I think I need the next slide, Sophie. Yeah, this is an example of one of the questions in the survey, and it's the example of a triplex in the R1 zone. One of the levers or topics that we have to write code for is minimum off-street parking or on-site parking that goes together with the building. At the allow level, the city could choose to require for a triplex 3 spaces to go with the building. And that is the most we can require according to the rules. So that's the basis or the base level of implementation in this example. If we take the encouraged level, we could reduce parking requirements to, for example, 1 to 2 spaces for the triplex, or allowing a credit for street side parking that might be located adjacent to a building. And lastly, for the incentivized option, the city could require no parking. For example, if the triplex is affordable, or if 1 or 2 of the units are affordable, or if it's located near transit. I want to emphasize that we haven't written the code yet. We're keeping the survey open and want to gather as much input as we can before going forward with a recommendation for where to land on things like parking. And again, this is just an example. There are many topics in the code, and if you've been following along with the Planning Commission at all, you might have seen what some of the other topics are. So that is an overview of our levels of implementation. I think we're pausing for questions. No questions. Dan.
So Terry, I do have a question about the affordable model. What exactly is that going to entail? So let's just say, so for an example, right now, and this is a project that we're looking to try to find a property for. We want to do a small mansion house, like a 4-unit mansion house with studios, basically 4 studio apartments, all in a really cute little building. So if, let's say, 2 were at market rate, what does the affordable piece mean as far as rent requirements?
Yeah, great question. That has not been determined yet, and we're sort of in the phase of gathering input and information about what other cities have done. For example, Portland has done a lot of work on this with their residential infill project. And so we're starting to look into those details, but at this point we haven't set, this percentage of average median income, or even how many of the units would have to be qualified as affordable. It's at the stage of inquiring about interest in this, and then working with our consultants on our project team to put out proposals that have some analysis behind them in terms of, if you require this, this is what's likely to happen in an affordable housing model or a market rate model. Another thing I should mention is that over the February outreach, and up to and including this meeting, in that kind of group of outreach meetings, we have heard a lot about hearing from developers and hearing more from developers. And so that's on my to-do list. My very short-term to-do list is to organize a focus group specifically with market rate and affordable housing developers to talk in more detail with them about incentives and different code requirements that would move the needle on their projects. So it's a really good question and very, very timely. And we'll invite you.
And John's hand is up, Terry.
Thank you. Terry, I understand the need to try to put boxes out there for people to land on. But it is challenging me to look at the incentivized box, which has 2 components, which is reduce minimal regulations and encourage incentives, et cetera. I'm not sure that those 2 are in line with each other. I mean, there are people who may not want to go to the minimum regulations, but do want to incentivize. So how do you respond to people that say, I agree with A, but not necessarily B, or B, not necessarily A?
It's a good question. I imagine we will hear that in the open-ended comments in the survey. We haven't gone through those yet. But what we've been hearing from our economic consultants all along is that there are things in the code that incentivize or encourage development to happen. So I think it's kind of a continuum. And I take your point that people's opinions might differ about changes in the code versus development incentives, but there are 2 different ways that we can affect the feasibility of a project. And so that's why we group them together.
Understood.
That makes sense?
Yeah, and I'll take advantage of the comments box. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Terry, here's another thing to put in that kind of the quiver of arrows here. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're finding when we're out looking for land, especially like oversized lots, is the infrastructure piece and just the challenges of bringing infrastructure into these sites. And I would highly recommend that the city have conversations about either offsetting systems development charges or figuring out ways to bring infrastructure, to those. The 2 that seem to be the elephants in the room are the stormwater and the sanitary sewer. Water and power is fairly easy, to bring to these sites, but the sanitary and the storm are both really challenging, we're finding, on a lot of properties that we're looking at. So
thank you. Yeah, that's on the table. And even electric has been brought up in terms of undergrounding requirements and different things like that. Alexis.
Thank you. This was helpful. I appreciate your presentation. And I'll say, I just liked, so the language around encouraging and incentivizing, in terms of the House Bill 2001 language says that cities shall consider, I think it's at least three different things. It's MUPD type thing, a system development charge waiver, and something else.
Construction excise tax.
Yeah, but it's like, but it seems like some of the things you're talking about that are incentivizing or encouraging here are beyond that. I'm just curious, what's the universe of potential things that will be offered?
That's a good question. I would say the universe is open. It just contains ideas that have been put into it to this point. Mm-hmm. So whether those are things that other cities have used or things suggested by Better Housing Together or the home builders or our consultant team, we have done other work around making housing affordable. For example, through the Housing Tools and Strategies project, a big list of ideas was generated. And so we're building off previous lists as well. But I do think they fall into kind of general categories of code or policy related things, process things, and money things. And so those could be fee reductions or SDC reductions or investments like public infrastructure or transit, those sorts of things. Transit's been coming up a lot actually, and expanding the public transportation system. Several groups have been bringing that up as an incentive to make it easier and more attractive to build housing in more places.
That's helpful, thank you.
I just have one quick thought to add to that, and it is building a little bit, I think, Terry, on what you just mentioned, and that I think it will be really important to keep an eye on the ball with regards to the cost structure, because it sounds to me like what we're saying is that there are a collection of incentivizing tools that have to do with bringing funding to projects or eliminating fees and additional cost in projects. And then there's another bucket of actions that has to do with basically allowing the developer to, pursue as thrifty of a project development program as they would like, right? Like you don't have to burden it with a bunch of extra parking. You don't have to burden it with a bunch of other program components that our housing code has decided is required with these units. But I just want to offer a thought or encouragement to keep an eye on the ball with regards to the cost actions, because it seems like sometimes in the effort to reduce cost, we can actually end up taking actions that add cost. And specifically, I'm thinking of all of the work that went into the discussion and negotiations around the creation of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and that the economic research that the city did, which at the time the development community felt was pretty optimistic, and maybe overly optimistic, still pointed towards missing middle housing being made infeasible by any additional increments beyond the amount that was established with the creation of that fund. So I just want to say that, because I think those are the moments, right, when we as a community start to get really confused about like what we're actually doing and how we're making progress. And, to be careful that, for example, we don't, in the interest of affordable housing writ large, capital A, capital H, implement a set of actions that we think are going to support missing middle housing, but then actually drive away. So to be really clear that if we're seeking capital A, capital H affordable housing, these are the strategies we need to use to isolate these other types of housing that we're trying to create a path to developing that's feasible, and make sure that those not get all tangled together. because there is already, I think, a pretty unfortunate misinformation campaign that's floating around in the community that equates a whole lot of things around affordability and affordable housing with the missing middle housing law. And I can imagine that it will be really easy for people to get turned upside down if that misinformation isn't really directly corrected in the record.
Thank you for that. I guess just one comment I would have about that is that we're trying to increase the clarity around kind of priority number one with implementing House Bill 2001 is complying with the House bill. And that has to result in amendments to our code that allow housing in more places. We do have some choices, but that's the nut of it. And then, as Alexis pointed out, there's this part of the bill that says you have to consider, cities must consider, and it's softer language, right? Consider affordability strategies around middle housing. And there's nothing stopping the city from considering affordability strategies for all housing, but that does clearly go beyond the scope of what we have to do to implement the House bill. I'm sort of conflicted about that because I want to use this opportunity where we have so many knowledgeable people gathered with thoughts about how to make a dent in the affordability issue. But I absolutely hear that. We need to do job number one first and make sure that that's really clear at every step in the process, what the actions we're proposing, how they affect that goal first.
Thank you.
Just to add to what Karen was saying too on the affordability piece, I think there's two components that we can't lose sight of. When we start looking inward within the UGB, the land prices tend to go up when we start offering these opportunities for development. It's really interesting just to see how large single family lots, the prices have increased so much over just even the last year, 15 months. It's a really remarkable thing. But then the other piece too that we have to always keep in mind is if a developer, because the only way to really get, I'm going to say, a buy-in from the development community is that it has to be profitable. And the banks, at least the banks that we work with, and I think I maybe mentioned this at our last roundtable, they require a pro forma on these projects, and these pro formas have to show at least a 6.5% return in order to procure financing on them. And so it's not just about wishing for this housing, it actually has to pencil to a degree. And again, I'm not talking about a subsidized model, I'm talking about a market rate model. And so what Karen is saying is really true. We can't lose sight of how we're actually going to see this take off and make a difference in our housing inventory. So these are things that I know a lot of times aren't discussed at probably staff level. Maybe I'm wrong, Terry, maybe they are, but it's just one of those things where I think it's really good to have input from those that are trying to understand how to make these projects pencil in a way where we can actually go out and procure, a 75% loan or somewhere in that range. It's not as easy as you might think. So.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Karen, did you have another question?
Well, I do. Actually, there are two more thoughts because two things that Dan just said made me sparked other ideas. One is that, similar to, the challenge of thinking of House Bill 2001 as a floor and what we actually need to accomplish in our community to address the housing need and affordability writ large. It's great to see the three examples that the state has laid out because they, provide a way of thinking about a range of solutions. Another one that I will throw out there as something to consider, to Dan's point, is that the ability to get these projects underway and the initial steeper incline that will go along with that in terms of securing financing is a place where we're the city to use, and I'm going to throw out something that will sound maybe crazy to people, but probably shouldn't, some essentially, loaned portion of our general reserves funding established as an impact fund and a revolving loan that is actually designed specifically to incentivize the private sector's engagement with this new type of project and this new type of housing, and to address some of that challenge in terms of securing the loan to actually get these projects to happen. It's another example of a type of tool that communities are starting to look at, because nobody has figured out how to answer these problems with the tools we have in the toolbox. So, and by that, in case what I just said wasn't clear, what it basically is, I can't remember the number of hundreds of millions of dollars that are sitting, that are part of our very, very good credit rating. But to think about how, some small portion of that money could be used to accomplish the community's needs and use the engine of the private sector's capacity to do that. The other thought I want to throw out there is that I think when Dan mentioned the sort of 2 and 2 and how would that work, that as this project continues to step forward, the need for some affordability analysis to understand, like, well, what does it look like when you have 2 market rate units with 2 units that are at 90% of AMI, which we're building 0 housing at, or even 100% of AMI, which we're building almost none or 0 units of housing at. What would that look like? What would it look like if you were trying to create a path for a nonprofit affordable housing, capital A, capital H developer to work on that site? What would they need in order to actually make a project work? I think that those kinds of sort of menu options for how it is that in our context, these units could actually believably find their way into the world will be really important when it gets down to the nuts and bolts of deciding where this toggle sits between allow and incentivize. I think the council and other decision-making bodies are going to need a lot of clarity around exactly like what it is that we're trying to incentivize, because they're going to be pummeled by people who say that that's not needed, when in fact it's desperately needed. Like, we need all of these different kinds of housing, and the city, sorry, I'm really got me on my soapbox, but it's the end of the long day. We need all of these kinds of housing, and everything that the city can do to encourage every single partner. Arbor South, I wrote it in the chat, 37 years of building in the community. I mean, I saw a note from Bill earlier about the anniversary, Dan, or somewhere in that distance.
38 years, Karen.
38 years, so right, so even longer. But there's a real need to not only take advantage of that expertise that's decades, but also to look at the people who are trying to accomplish these projects right now, the work that Cultivate is doing, Dylan Lamar's projects, who's stepping into these spaces and trying to build a development company and a housing production company, and is locally based business that actually wants to help us meet these goals. I can't say enough how important it is for the city to just really be listening and thinking, how do we do everything humanly possible to help you get these units onto the market as soon as possible? Because the Freddie Mac numbers came out, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. Oregon housing deficit at 8.8%. The only place in the country higher is DC, which is like 9.5. Washington is third, and they're at like 5.7% housing deficit. Like, these are, and this is not just like a Portland problem. I want to put that into the notes captured also. So the need to actually get more things to happen sooner is critical. And there's a lot of feeling of like things are not going to happen very quickly, which is probably true. So if we can actually try to do things to get a few more things to happen sooner rather than later, it would be, it would help a lot of people.
Excuse me. Thank you. You're nicely forecasting our next step.
Thank you, everyone. And just to be respectful of time, we're at time for questions about the levels of implementation. But Terry and I are always available over email, or we love doing a good one-on-one Zoom call. So if we would love to hear from you outside of tonight. And with that, we have a 5-minute break scheduled. So I will see you back here at 6:17. So stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, and see you soon. Looks like this break was needed. I'll give it till more of the squares light up. Welcome back. Okay. I think I will get started again. Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah, forgive me, folks. I've got a meeting that I need to start running at 7, so I will disappear 5 or 10 minutes before, and I want to apologize in advance. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So now we are going to live up to this group's name and have a roundtable discussion that is structured to hear from everyone. I'll call on you all just one at a time. I'll try to change up the order to keep it exciting. What we're hoping to hear from tonight is, in your opinion, which levels of implementation best meet the 3 components of the triple bottom line or TBL framework. I sent out an attachment with more information about the TBL. The reason why we are using the TBL is because council has supported viewing projects through a triple bottom line framework lens, and projects try to get feedback on the triple bottom line. So we're using your input tonight to shape staff's recommendation and provide justification for why our recommendation looks the way that it does by using the triple bottom line framework. We'll be asking the same question pretty much 3 times. So it'll start out a little awkward, but trust me, it'll work. But we'll have a different lens each time. So we'll start with social equity, then go to environment, and then end with economic prosperity. We'll take it one at a time. So this first one is about social equity, and it's which implementation option allow, encourage, incentivize best promotes social equity. And then there's the second part that is, do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? We'll have about 2 minutes per person for each of the 3 questions, and I'll exit out so I can see everyone and put the question in the chat. And then if we have time after everybody goes around once, then we can have a little bit more discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and exit out of this PowerPoint. Put this here in the chat. And if I call on you and you're not ready, just let me know and I can defer you down the queue. So I will get started. Let's start with John.
Thanks. Well, you heard my concern, which is this is a large box, the encouraged box. So let me speak generically. First of all, I said I speak for the NLC. I don't speak for the NLC. There is a wide range of attitudes among neighborhood leaders about what to do about this issue. So I can't possibly represent them all, and I wouldn't even try. So I'll speak for myself as a neighborhood leader. I think the social equity lens is the most important. My biggest concern is that House Bill 2001 may encourage more housing, but it doesn't do what we want to do unless it encourages affordable housing, whether it's big H, big A, big H, or small a, big H, or housing affordability. And that's where I think incentives are going to be the best solution. Just an observation, the question about parking, what we establish as code will set minimum standards. Developers will decide what they think is important for parking. So even if we say you don't have to have any parking for a fourplex, a developer may well decide I can't sell this fourplex unless I have 4 parking spaces. So keep that in mind. But I totally support the idea of incentives. We won't get to where we need to be if we can't. The downside of reducing standards is the more you reduce standards, the more likely you potentially able to create opposition, specifically parking and size and scale. The neighborhood livability folks are going to start coming out as soon as you say, well, you can go beyond the minimum standards to build larger housings than single family housing. I understand the desirability of that. I question whether or not the cost publicly in the community will be worth it. So I don't think I answered your question, but I did get to say what I wanted. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And we'll go over to Seth.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I think in most of the parameters, everything we can do to encourage and incentivize more small development makes it more likely that we're going to have development that can be affordable. And if we do extra incentivization for capital A affordable housing, then that is even better. Although I'd like to, I mean, I feel like most of the concerns are about mature neighborhoods, but the opportunities are small and infrequent in mature neighborhoods, which means that there won't be as much impact. For example, you know, there's an empty house on my block, and you could replace that with something that went to the edge of the property line and was pretty tall, and it wouldn't really change the infrastructure needs in my block because it's just one small lot and it wouldn't change much. So I guess, sorry, was there a second half of the question?
Yes, do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? And those are the three things we ask about in the survey specifically.
Yes, I'm a little more sympathetic to restrictions on lot coverage than the other things. I think every new parking space makes us all closer to death. And I can't get off my environmental and transportation advocate horse for that one. So I certainly don't want more parking than the market requires anywhere, ever. And I have a little sympathy to limiting lot coverage.
Thank you, Seth. And we will move over to Carmen.
I would like to see us encouraging and incentivizing outcomes across the board. I think the strategies might be a little bit different. And it's probably important to at least observe, you know, that unfortunately, any time that there's sort of an opening to wield something that is meant to be productive against the creation of housing, that has seemed to happen in the last several decades. So even as an architect, it makes me, you know, a little bit nervous to think about doing anything that would make it more difficult for people to assess and develop properties to deliver housing units. I do think that one thing that happens is we have our lot coverage standards, and then we also have our setback standards, and we also have our maximum height standards. And that one piece that you see play out continually is a desire to reduce both maximum height and allowable coverage, as well as increase setbacks, which very quickly generates almost no developable area within that site. And it's a pressure point, I think, in neighborhoods. It's presented as in sort of a fear-mongering perspective. Lot coverage, it's like, oh, this is the way you protect your urban tree canopy. You know, you don't want lot coverage to be allowed. But then, you know, people say, well, that's okay. We could build something really compact and have it be, you know, two stories with a cute dormer attic on it. That would be great. And then, the same fear mongering comes around and says, oh, your privacy's gone, and your solar access is gone. And that is super counterproductive, right? And I'm just gonna like keep saying some of this stuff really bluntly, because I think it should be in your notes and in the feedback to leadership that we can't have these openings for flexibility be manipulated around into things that actually work against creating housing. So I land very far to the side of incentivizing, and I want for there to be really, high quality outcomes from the housing that we produce in this next generation. It's going to need to last for a while and do a good job for a couple of generations. But I don't see a lot of the things that are being discussed, given the structure of the model code and the law, as pushing us in necessarily good directions with the standards.
Thank you, Karen. How about Alexis?
Well, first of all, Karen, to your last comment in the chat, I'll just cede all of my time to you because I love everything you have to say. But so I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I'll say from just looking at this, I'm not sure what other ways people are going to twist the concerns around equity, but I just want to make sure that we flag that, like, how is it economics and racial segregation are a much larger equity concern than say concerns about needing to walk an extra block if you can't find a parking space immediately in front of your home. And that the main reason for doing all of this is a primary reason for doing all of this is to desegregate our housing market as much as possible, both economically and racially. And I think that means that we incentivize, as to the greatest extent possible, all middle housing types across all neighborhoods. And I think the answer to the second part of the question around differing, if the answer differs, I would say I still probably strongly favor encouraging and incentivizing across different subcategories of these, like to parking and lot coverage. And I would just say that the emphasis would be stronger on the ones that have higher impact. So probably lot coverage is going to have more of a cost factor if you, or I don't know if lot coverage includes minimum lot size, but minimum lot size is going to have a huge cost factor compared to some design standards per se. So I would say that the answer would be more emphatically incentivize things that are touching on areas that are, have a higher cost factor. Sorry, I'm not saying that well, but that's all I have.
Thank you, Alexis. How about Brittany?
Sorry, my mouse stopped working as soon as I needed it. I concur with a lot of what Alexis and Karen just said. I think the social equity piece, and Alexis kind of touched on this, to me, it has a lot more to do with, and I think this would put me in the camp of incentivizing to make it possible, is making sure specific areas of our community are not easier or cheaper to build in, which therefore, segregates lower income folks who can buy the, I think that's the bigger issue to me. So if we can incentivize so it's affordable for someone to live in a neighborhood that's perceived as more highly desirable, then that's how I think we address the social inequities. So I don't know that it's, like Alexis said, has more to do with the parking lot or the lot coverage as it does to make sure that every neighborhood can have affordable places to live for people.
Thanks, Brittany. Let's hear from Carmel.
So I've been thinking about this, and I think as a member of the BIPOC community, I can say that allow for me comes to the forefront, because there's been so much that just hasn't been allowed, and that really has created this inequity. But at the same time, when you're talking about design standards, those things can really create barriers. People can use all those things to create barriers so that this can't happen, whether it's allowed or not. If we restrict this or restrict that, it just kind of piles up and you're not going to make any headway because we've created more barriers. And so, but I do at the same time think that incentivizing across the board is going to be important, because how do you ask a builder, how do you ask Dan or Ed to go build a house on a lot that they're not going to make any money on? Why would they do that? So we have to really just kind of do as much as we can.
Thank you, Carmel. Let's go to Dan.
So I wrote down a few notes here, just that thinking about this question. The first thing is I think about the Whitaker neighborhood because it's close to my office, and I've been watching the gentrification of what's been happening in the Whitaker neighborhood, which was at one point considered one of the least desirable neighborhoods in our city, actually for many, many years. And what's interesting to me is, it's probably one of the most culturally diverse neighborhoods in our city, both racially and economically. You'll have people that are high income earners and low income earners in that particular area. So I think we have to be careful too about how we look at neighborhoods, and especially when we're implementing design standards, parking requirements, and lot coverage. There's in reality, there's diversity in all of those things. I think about cities that I've traveled to where literally there's 2 feet or 3 feet between houses, and they're wonderful neighborhoods like New Orleans, the shotgun houses. So, we can't be short-sighted to say, well, we need a minimum 10-foot setback if you're going to do an infill project. I think those are, really important things to discuss about how we're looking at, our design standards piece. Parking, I go back to, it's really hard for me to get financing on a project that doesn't have parking. I'm just being real honest with you guys. It's just when the banks look at these pro formas and they look at our designs, they realize that, I think the latest statistics are that 80% of the people in Lane County own a car. That's a huge percentage, whether we like it or not. And I'm not promoting, transportation necessarily from a single vehicle, single occupant model at all, but I'm just saying it's a reality because we're more of a rural based kind of location. And so I think we have to be really careful about how we look at our parking standards. I honestly would not buy a property or a piece of land if I couldn't find some area to do parking on it. I think it would be a death sentence in most areas in Eugene, and even probably more so in Springfield. So that's one that I think, again, probably needs greater discussion. Lot coverage is another one. I'm a big believer that open space is really important to health, just the health of the occupants of a design. As an architect, I believe that, front porches are key to just connectivity to the neighborhoods, but I also believe some private space is really important. So I'm a big proponent of looking at, how we look at lot coverage. But lot coverage can happen in a lot of different ways. It's just not a rubber stamp on some guidelines. I think it has to do with surrounding parcels, the type of neighborhood you're living in, and what that open space requirement, looks like. And obviously, trees and vegetation play into this in a huge way, as well. I think the last thing I'll just finish with is the affordability piece. And again, I know I've mentioned this, I probably sound like a broken record over the last 10 years on this, but, our subsidized housing model is the least affordable housing model that we actually build. It's now approaching $300,000 a door for most affordable housing projects in the state of Oregon. Some areas it's much higher than that. So I think we have to be really careful about what percentage of our marketplace is dictated by the affordable housing model, which is subsidized by all of us, in some way, which is great. But at the same time, because of the regulations, because of the standards, we have to be really careful about what percentage of our affordable housing model is subsidized. And it's growing, but it's still a really small percentage of what our housing stock is, a very small percentage. Karin might know the statistics on that, but my gut would tell me that it's probably 15% or less of our actual housing stock is in the affordable housing model. So anyway.
Thank you, Dan. And last but not least, Ed.
Well, I'll keep it short. First of all, I'll say that I think parking is going to be the big issue when this all goes out to the community. And definitely in support of trying to incentivize these projects. If we don't incentivize them, they're not going to happen. And I almost feel like we need to bring our consultants back to reanalyze what is feasible today, because there's been a lot of changes recently. Right now, a standard home cost has increased 16 to 20,000 just for lumber prices. And I feel like we need to have a good base on where we're at now to figure out what kind of incentives we need to develop to really make this happen. Another concern that I have is in Eugene, a lot of this is going to happen in existing dwellings that are going to have to be torn down. And I'm not sure the asbestos or the lead-based paint removal and all the containment and everything has been included in what is or isn't feasible. And I think we need to know that before we come up with the incentives. And thank you so much for all the great comments. You guys are on it. That's it. Thank
you, Ed. Now we're going to move on to our next question, which will be very similar to you. Now I'm going to be asking about environmental health. So which implementation option, allow, encourage, incentivize, best promotes environmental health? And do your questions differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? I'll put that in the chat. And just because he's leaving us soon, I'm going to start off with John.
I've seen a pattern here, Sophie, and thank you for that, because I do have to leave. I think the situation, people have covered it already. I mean, if you increase lot size, you decrease tree canopy, solar access, et cetera. It's a tough nut, and I don't have the answers, but I do think that incentives are the better way to do it. If you provide an incentive to increase lot coverage or what, that's not the best way to spend your money. But if you were to spend it on increasing lot coverage, perhaps you could provide some sort of another incentive. I don't know. I really don't. I don't have the answer. I just know it's a tough issue, and I apologize for eating up any more airtime with not knowing what to say.
Thank you, John. How about Brittany?
I have my notes on this other screen, or the documents you sent out, so I'm not ignoring you guys. I don't know. I'm with John too. I feel like, well, I don't know. This is a hard one, because I feel like when we're talking about incentivizing and making things less strenuous, then yeah, you're going to have folks who want to have, fewer trees on the property line, or maybe they are blocking someone else's capacity to have solar. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the other two, environmental or social and economic prosperity, don't outweigh the fact that there's people who don't have homes. So I feel like that's just, to me, that outweighs any kind of solar impact you might have for a specific housing type. So I'm still in the incentivized category.
Thank you, Brittany. Let's go to Ed.
I find myself stuck on this one too, and looking forward to hearing other people's comments.
Thank you, Ed. Let's go to Seth.
Biggest driver. Okay, this is good because most of the time the rest of you are doing what you do for a living and I sound like a dilettante, but I actually know a thing or two about environmental health. And this basically, the more people you can get living close to where they go every day, i.e. in the core of Eugene, rather than in outlying areas, the better it's going to be for environmental health. And that leads to encourage and incentivize everything we can to do more close-in infill. You know, I guess I went off on parking on the last question, so I don't have to do it again now. You know, lot coverage is a little bit different because there are stormwater issues and there are issues with having trees in the city, but allowing things to get taller is the way you offset that. And I know, I think everybody on this call has heard the complaints about people who don't like things to get taller. So, you know, that's going to be an issue. And I guess one more thing I just want to remind everybody of, and it's really good to hear the perspectives of from the builders on what can pencil out today. And I know that what can pencil out today is a really important consideration, but we're writing rules that might not be looked at for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And so let's remember that we want to allow space for creativity. We want to allow different things to happen. And you know, what will pencil out today is important because we have a crisis right now that we're trying to solve. But what will pencil out today might not be the only thing, because what will pencil out 5 years from now or 10 years from now, it'd be really nice to have a good zoning code we like that can encourage those things to happen.
Thank you, Seth. Let's go to Alexis.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay right now? Okay. I just wasn't sure if these headphones have a mic in them or not. Yeah, like Seth just mentioned, I think the big win environmentally, especially from a climate perspective, is just that people will not need to travel as much in single occupant vehicles if we incentivize more housing in all neighborhoods. But I will say, I think that this question kind of introduced an interesting thing for me, I guess, because some of the concerns that we might have around housing and environmental issues, like tree canopy coverage and green space and open space, I think that we can actually build incentives that both incentivize more housing and you know, do things to protect the environment. Like we can have a tree preservation policy that you know, can give a density bonus for saving trees above a certain diameter on a property, or we could do the same type of bonus for lot coverage or around like impermeable surface if we're worried about stormwater, things like that. So I don't think the incentivize is, we have to look at it as though it's always going to be at the cost of the environment, because I think that we can incentivize to, you know, promote good environmental outcomes even on like an individual lot scale. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Alexis. Hop over to Dan.
So environmentally, there's, again, it's kind of a loaded question. There's so many components to this. You know, we have actually one of the strictest energy codes in the country. And our codes are adding costs to our building, our construction costs to our buildings these days, which again, I'm a huge fan of. Our business was founded on, environmentally sustainable architecture, and I love doing that, but I also know the cost adds anywhere from 15 to 25%, to achieve, sustainability and net zero, numbers. So we already are doing a lot just by our built-in codes that are in the state of Oregon from an environmental standpoint. The vehicle miles traveled, this is something that's always kind of bothered me about Eugene. Our housing costs have gotten so high that so many people are living in Veneta, Elmira, Junction City, Crestwell, Cottage Grove, and their carbon footprint is actually growing because they have to travel to go to their job. And so, again, this goes to the affordability of land. It goes to the affordability of construction costs. Ed mentioned, lumber prices are the highest they've ever been. It's crazy how much it's adding to the cost of construction. So every time we look at all these, I'm going to call them wish lists that we have, while in theory and in principle, and I agree with Seth, we don't want to think about just today. We want to think about, the future. But at the same time, I think we have to still look at what housing costs today and make sure that it's a viable model that we can construct housing that is, I don't even like to use the word affordable anymore, because I don't really think affordable housing is achievable, at least in a market, in a typical market setting right now. So the question is how do we create housing that's reasonable, I guess, is the way I would phrase it, versus, necessarily affordable. The other thing that I think, going back to the energy code too, we're doing things all the time, and Oregon has always been a really progressive state. And I love this about Oregon. We have things like now we have to pre-plumb for solar PV on our roofs. These are all things that make our homes environmentally more responsible. So it increases the quality, obviously, of the housing itself, but it also eliminates some of the costs that's associated with owning housing or renting housing. So these are things that are all really positive, but we can't lose sight of what all these new requirements are adding to the cost of housing. So, so that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Dan. Let's hear from Carmel.
Okay, so this is an interesting question for me. I mean, I appreciate how much environmental requirements are, that are in place in Oregon. As I look at the land prices, my first initiative is like, why are we not building outside of town a little bit? I grew up in Texas. I just recently lived in Texas. And when you say the word sprawl, just put up a picture of Texas, because that's sprawl. And, the urban growth boundaries of cities are huge. Fort Worth, where I lived, was 800 and something square miles. I mean, if you can imagine, it's very, very large. However, when I drive through town, I also see a whole lot of empty lots. And my question is, why aren't we doing something with all these empty lots that not only are empty, but they're ugly because they have weeds and they look, so I think we need to find a good balance, because first of all, if we think we don't have sprawl in Oregon, we're wrong, because just drive between Eugene and the coast and there's houses everywhere. So people are building where they, as Dan said, they're building where are buying houses where they think it's cheaper, but they're still increasing their footprint because they're still driving to town to buy groceries. They're still driving all these different places. So, I don't have the answer. I'm just kind of, so it's a hard thing for me because, I don't work in the industry of building houses. This is new to me. And, but I keep seeing all these kind of things that are kind of opposing each other. We say we don't want sprawl, but yet we kind of allow it, and we don't increase the urban growth boundary, but yet we also don't do anything for infill. So, we're going to have to find some common ground here and do something, but I don't think that it's happening right now.
Thank you, Carmel. And last, I have Karen.
I tried to write these down into kind of 4 big categories, thinking about environmental health specifically. I would land definitely in the incentive camp relative to this question. The 4 things I wanted to mention is 1, of course, we're dealing with needing to use the land we have more efficiently to benefit our environmental health, more compact development, less sprawl across the landscape, less impervious surface over surfaces that were once part of a functioning watershed or providing for the food shed for that community or natural resources that community needs. So efficient use of land is key, and I would see as an action item related to this, like where is there land that we have somehow decided is not useful or not on the table that's already within our UGB that we should be allowing for housing development? Are there lots that could be created that should be allowable that we have said we don't want to have be available for whatever reason that actually conflict with these much larger values and more difficult goals to accomplish? So I would add in sort of that layer as an action item. The second is around urban heat island effect, which gets back to our continuous tree canopy concerns. A lot of times the conversation is focused on the trees that are tree canopies in privately owned backyards that are covering what is otherwise also a green surface. In terms of environmental health, the place we need tree canopy coverage is over our impervious surface. So we need like continuous street tree canopy over and along our streets, over our sidewalks and impervious street surfaces to manage that heat island and to help mitigate some of that rainwater that turns into stormwater, right? I think it's like 30% that if it lands in the tree doesn't land into your stormwater system. That's a beautification project across the entire city and across every neighborhood. It's an environmental health project, and it's also a cost mitigation strategy, in that it might be able to help us deal with some of our stormwater challenges on those sites, because reducing the impervious surface requirements on those private parcels is also a piece of that. And then the last one gets back to some of the DEQ's research, which has been really helpful around affordable and also missing middle housing opportunities. And that, the long-term operational energy costs associated with homes that are much larger than we need, that is an environmental cost. And so making sure that we're creating opportunities for smaller and efficient homes to be knit into our community fabric is really important if we're talking about trying to save energy and minimize greenhouse gas production.
Thank you, Karen. And John wanted to add to his comment before leaving today.
Yeah, I apologize. I do have to go. I started writing this down, so I'll just read it. I need to go, but I should have made one more point about regs versus incentives. Unfortunately, not all builders are as environmentally and, dare I say, socially conscious as Arbor South and the other wonderful builders that we love. We are more likely to get housing we desire if we reward the well-designed development we want through incentives rather than write standards that may well allow the creation of designs that significantly deviate from our intent. It's happened many times before. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I have 4 minutes in case anybody else would like to make comments related to environmental health and the levels of implementation. All right, we're just going to plow through. So our last question tonight, and I'll briefly share my screen again, is about economic prosperity. So which implementation option allow, encourage, incentivize, best promotes economic prosperity And do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? And I will put this in the chat again. Try to call on you in a creative order. Let's start with Brittany.
I'm unincentivized for this one for sure. The reason the chamber is engaged in this work is because if folks can't find places to live, then we can't have enough employees for businesses to thrive, and people aren't going to be living to their fullest potential. So we have to incentivize housing. As far as, I don't know, parking lot coverage, design standards, I guess the only area where I start to weigh the public opinion on this and whether it's going to actually inhibit us from getting scenario, it's incentivized, but if it's going to keep us from being able to get this through neighborhoods, then that's one where I would be willing to say encourage approach to on those design standards, but that's the only one where I think I might give.
Thank you, Brittany. And you broke out for a bit for me, but I think I heard that you're incentive and then maybe encourage with parking because it's more contentious. Is that right?
I said design standards.
Design standards. I'm glad you corrected me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's hear from Dan.
Okay, I'm going to start with a personal story here. So, you know, I was raised in a little tiny farming town in southern Idaho. I came from a pastor's family who had nothing. And I'm going to tell you that the greatest opportunity for me was understanding that I could build equity in real estate and in my home. And it set my life on a completely different trajectory, coming from what would have been considered an impoverished family, you know, in my younger years. And so I'm a huge believer in the value of owning your own home and creating, whether it's through sweat equity or long-term ownership. I think the biggest piggy bank you can have in your life is owning a home. And so for me, this has always been a huge thing, not only for me personally, but also for those that come from maybe a situation like myself. So I would just say that the economic prosperity piece cannot be understated when it comes to home ownership. You know, people refer to it as the American dream. I say it's one of the most sound investments you can make in your life is to own a home. And if you have any kind of ability at all to put sweat equity into that home, then I think we should create every opportunity possible for people to do that. Every opportunity, whether it's on an infill lot, on a vacant lot, you know, wherever it is. You know, I just think it's really important. I'm going to share one other thing, and I know a few of you know about this project, the Blossom Cottages on River Road. I honestly wanted to build that project as a for sale product where I could get people into small housing for under $200,000 a piece. I could not do it. There was no way physically, financially possible to create housing under $200,000 in the city of Eugene. And I'm going to tell you, I would have taken the smallest percentage possible to make that happen for 8 people to own those cottages, and I could not do it. So, and the reason being was because, again, of our public works requirements, our planning requirements, and other things. It just made it financially impossible for me to do that. I wanted to do it. And you can talk to Terry and other people in the city that knew about that project early on as we started it. But I just couldn't figure out a way to make it happen. So it makes me sad that we cannot provide housing, under $250,000 barrier right now that's quality, energy efficient housing, sustainable housing for our community. It just drives me crazy every day. And so I think, the prosperity part about housing, it cannot be understated. It just gives everybody a leg up on the future of their life as they grow older and older. It just gives them the opportunity to have, an asset that they would never otherwise probably have. So that's my pitch, and I'm sticking to it. So.
Thank you, Dan. Let's hear from Carmel.
Thank you, Sophie. So a few years ago, AARP, and we release updates every now and then, released a report called The Longevity Economy that really looked at the economic power of retirees. And so not only are young people who are graduating from U of O not able to stay here because they can't afford to buy a house and raise their families, but we're also losing that retiree market. Just yesterday, the top places to retire in the country came out, and it's Florida. Well, the reason it's Florida is because of housing options. And so I think it's really, incentivizing that affordable housing, giving some choices to people who want to buy that affordable house that Dan was talking about. The cottage projects are fabulous places that younger people might, that might be an entry-level home for them, or an older adult that might be an entry-level or their retirement place for them. But we don't have those options in Eugene. They just don't exist because, and I just think we need to incentivize. But I do think that design standards are really important. Again, we do not want to create barriers, but we also want to look at the designs. One thing that I really appreciate about Dan is that he is one of the builders that looks at design in terms of, does it fit people of all ages, and so we need to start looking at those kinds of things when we're looking at design standards and not create barriers.
Thank you, Carmel. Let's go to Ed.
Well, I agree with Carmel on being very careful with design standards because they can add a lot of cost to a project as well. And just ditto on everything that Dan said. I was sitting here going, amen, brother, keep it going. Home ownership is so important for the future of a family. And I hope we can get there. It's going to be a big hurdle.
Thank you, Ed. How about Karn?
All three of these categories, I think, are things that if you're an elected official right now looking at our field position, they should wake you up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. And the economic prosperity piece related to housing is one where I worry that, like some of the others, it won't really hit home to people until after we're so deep in a hole or have lost so much ground that, then it's 20 times harder, right, to regain that position or those opportunities. The access to home ownership is absolutely critical, not just for economic development, but for the other two reasons, especially racial equity and social equity that we talked about. Home ownership remains the most reliable primary means of generating wealth in your lifetime if you are not inheriting money from someone, right? So that remains true. And it should be really startling to people when they hear that if you aren't, inheriting money or bringing significant resources into this community from somewhere else, you can't access that market. That should really bother a lot of people. It should bother them a lot more than it bothers them right now. And when I think about the draw of this place and our position within the world and all of the resources and the beauty of this landscape, I worry a lot about our ability to have a workforce that is able to actually invest and set down roots here and build all of the other pieces of the economy and community that go along with deciding to make a place the place that you want for your life or your family to be invested in. So definitely on the incentivized side of this. And the only other aspect or like twist that I would add far on the incentivized side is that in thinking about development pattern, we may also want to look at how as our landscape changes and the fundamental opportunity of housing diversity changes in all of Oregon's communities, but in this community, is there a way that we want to think about neighborhood centers or sort of community centers as still being a part of our thinking with development? Is that, in thinking about a walkable neighborhood, typically that means that there is a neighborhood center, right? That has a handful of small commercial elements or entities gathered together in a place that many different people go to. And as we're thinking about this whole landscape changing and allowing more housing diversity, there's sort of another layer of thinking about incentivizing the identity giving commercial components to that, because we can't just have 75 miles of commercial mixed use redevelopment. We don't need that, right? It wouldn't make any sense. But our neighborhoods do need centers and want them, really, really badly. It's what everyone talks about in their neighborhoods, wanting a place that they can walk to. It's what makes, small housing such a delight to have access to.
Thank you, Karen. How about Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is one of the good things about what we're going to do with HB 2001 rather than working on a particular area, is that it's going to apply to the whole city, and it's also going to apply to the rich neighborhoods. And, being able to put smaller things in the wealthy neighborhoods that people who are not so wealthy can afford can be a big deal toward improving our economy, both for the people who get access to the rich area and for the sort of big picture, so we can have economic growth. So, I mean, I say as much as we can do, basically as much as we can do is going to be good for our economy, because we all see the people struggling to pay rent, and we all see the people commuting from Veneta and Creswell and Coburg, and who might prefer to live in Eugene. Obviously, some people want to live in Veneta or Creswell or Coburg, and I'm not going to pick on people for that. But if people who work in Eugene and would like to live in Eugene are living in Veneta or Creswell or Coburg because they can't find a place here, that I think is a problem. So yeah, I'd say, encourage, incentivize the most we can do in order to promote economic prosperity with more housing. I mean, I think really the lack of housing is holding back our economic prosperity right now.
Thank you, Seth. Last but not least, Alexis.
Thank you. And speaking last, I've agreed with everything everyone has said so far, so I'm not going to go and repeat things. But to Brittany's point about, so she talked about employees need to have a place to live in order for them to be even applying to jobs. I'll also say that if housing is unaffordable, people don't have expendable income to spend at local businesses. And that is another element of the economic side that I don't think has been mentioned yet. So I'll just leave it there, but I agree with everything else said.
Thank you. Are there any other comments about economic prosperity and levels of implementation? All right. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
This is only
Karen, I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Just also that I think lose sight of the long-term impact when people are just barely able to make ends meet and put pieces together. I had a cookie delivery. That over a lifetime adds up into a really unstable second half of life. And there was a statistic that I ran across a couple of years ago that pointed out that the majority of instances of homelessness, first instance of homelessness, are after age 50. And it has to do with having lived an entire life just barely able to make things work, and then having no resilience for later in life when things get a little bit more difficult. So this is another piece where you just think, if everyone is only barely making it all the time, everyone, what happens when things go wrong? And that's a terrible position for a community to be in. It's wrong that people aren't able to save anything for retirement because their housing costs are 70% of their income. It's wrong that they don't have access to healthcare, that, all sorts of other things. So I hope that gets bundled into this conversation about economic prosperity, because those things also influence what economic mobility and opportunities people can pursue. You don't see people going back to school when they can't make their monthly housing and grocery bill payments, right? Or deciding to start a business. They can't tolerate that risk.
Thank you, Karen. Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to let Seth know that Coburg is one of the most expensive areas to live in right now. It's not very affordable out there in Coburg. But one thing I just wanted to share with you.
Okay, Veneta and Creswell.
There you go. Interestingly enough, Elliot Eisenberg, he's called the bow tie economist. He's somebody that I've been following for a long, long time. He's really a brilliant economist. And I just read a report from him this week, in fact, that said Oregon is the third highest migration state in the country right now. Third highest. That means of all 50 states, Oregon is the third most popular state to move to. So the one thing I want to make sure that everybody on our little roundtable here understands, that when you have a high migration state, real estate prices are going to do nothing but go up in value, and probably significantly, because we've become a desirable state for lots of reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, for retirement reasons, for, we don't have hurricanes and tornadoes and, all the other reasons that people love Oregon. So our problem is not going to get easier. It's going to get worse, because our median income is significantly lower than most states, and yet our housing costs are some of the highest in the country per capita. So it's really an interesting problem that we have, that we're looking at. And so, I don't know how much the council talks about these things, but those of us in the industry that follow these things, these are really important trends that are going to make dramatic impacts on how we look at our housing stock. And so, and I'm not saying that I have any answers at all. I'm just trying to do my part every day to, build high quality, good, sustainable housing. But there's a storm brewing that I think is much bigger, and Karen's kind of alluded to it, that's much bigger than we think. And so I just don't want to lose sight of that. And I'm not trying to be a glass half empty person. I'm a glass half full guy, but these are challenges that are on the horizon for us. So.
Thank you, Dan. All right. With that, I guess we'll all say glass half filled. I'm going to end on a positive note by saying that we are ahead of schedule. So we're going to go into our wrap up, and Terry's going to take it away.
Just to end on another sobering note, we got an email today from the state that has new data saying that Eugene has the third worst percentage of severely cost burdened population. So we're not going in the right direction yet. I think we might have been number 3 last time also. Thank you all for this really rich discussion. This has been great. I've been taking lots of notes, and so has Julie. And so I really appreciate you saying all the things that you're saying and helping us get all of these points up to decision makers. So let me get the right screen up with my notes. Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, Sophie. So this is an image of our overall project schedule. You might notice that it only goes through June, and that's because this original graphic was built by our consultants that we hired through a state grant to work on our code for middle housing. So the work will continue after June, but that is the end of our contract with the consultants that are helping us draft the code. So that's where we are now. You can see major check-ins with Planning Commission and City Council, and we're going to be adding a couple of check-ins. A lot of the points that you've been making, others in the community have been making, and the level of information and contacts to council has been increasing. And so we want to add a check-in with the City Council to make sure that we're elevating all of the outreach that we're doing with all of these roundtables and getting that information front and center to our decision makers. So we're asking for a date in April to share with the council what we've been hearing. As Sophie mentioned at the beginning, we're in an engagement blitz right now with an online survey. It closes on Friday, meetings in a box, all of these roundtable meetings and health and democracy meetings. And I put the question in the chat about meeting together in April because I wanted to get John's answer and Karen's before they had to leave. But we asked this of the boards and commissions folks last week because there's such interest in the topic of housing affordability and in also finally getting to look at the code. We don't have the code yet, but when we do have it, we want to be able to show it to you, discuss it with you, and get your feedback. And so one idea we had was to do a combined meeting in April. It would be an additional meeting, but we would combine two groups. You guys are about 8. The boards and commissions group is 6, I believe. So it's still not that huge of a group. But if we combined you together, we could get some cross-pollination between the different perspectives, even more than we've gotten in this group, which has been really good already. So 4 of you, I think, said yes already in the chat. I'm interested in the rest of you who didn't have a chance to answer, if you'd be willing to do that. Thank you. Dan, I think Alexis maybe didn't answer, but I bet he's game for another meeting.
Yeah, that's definitely game.
Maybe Seth.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. This is actually really exciting because I think the 2 topics for April are going to be kind of what we've all been waiting for. What are we recommending in the code for you to react to? And then kind of on a very important next track, like we discussed earlier, what else can we start doing to talk about affordability and dial in incentives that'll actually work, both for middle housing and hopefully for other kinds of housing. Several of you might be aware that the City Council and the city in general is also bringing back the housing tools and strategies work. There's a council work session on March 10th where community development staff will be proposing that we move into the development of a housing implementation pipeline, which is their new name for a housing action plan. But basically it's actions. It's actions that the city should be taking and checking in with council about that. So this work feeds right into that bigger conversation about housing. As I said before, task number 1, adopt a code that complies with the House bill. But I think it's also possible to be aware of how this fits into the larger picture. And people have really been asking for that. One last thing on the affordability strategies, there is work already anticipated, and it's on this chart. I guess it's not called out, but as part of task 7, the code framework that the consultants are working on right now, there is economic analysis that is going to be done by Echo Northwest to look at the recommended code and its impact on development feasibility of the different middle housing types. So that's under contract, it's part of their scope. And we've been starting to talk about other work that we may need to have done, including the developer focus group and kind of digging into what incentives work for market rate or affordable housing structures. So that will probably have to be additional work that the city contracts to have done, but we have money to do it and really want to do it. as we head into these next couple of months. That was a lot. I already plugged the survey again. We're up to 500 responses. So
530.
oh my gosh, it's been a good day. That's phenomenal. Really good job, Sophie. She's been promoting it all over the place. That's great, but you still have 5 days to take it. And I'll stop now and ask for your question. Yeah.
Hey, I just want to say thank you to Sophie and Terry. You guys have a really challenging job, and I know there's a lot of stuff that you guys try to cover in these meetings, but I really appreciate your efforts, your just your temperament about all this stuff, because it's tough work. One thing I just want to add that's kind of been I've been thinking about in the back of my mind is people who own oversized lots. I really think it would be important to maybe have a program that educates people on how they can do something on their own property, and create maybe even a team of builders or developers that can help people navigate this process. I for one would be totally willing to sign up to, try to, be a mentor in this process, because a lot of people want to do it, but they become completely overwhelmed so quickly when they look at the process. But I think if we're really going to look at housing in a wider, in a wider spectrum, we need to look at both the owner occupier and the owner developer standpoint, not just the developer standpoint. So I would really encourage the city to take a look at maybe creating a program and information that helps the individual homeowner who has a development opportunity. So just put that in on your list of many, many to-dos. So
I would add to that, just educating folks on what it would look like to develop something new, right? I think that, and Cara, and I know we've talked about this with Better Housing Together. This is something that we're interested in. Is, we have a finite number of housing developers in this community, it feels like, and folks like you, Dan, have put in hours and hours of your time. How do we help make sure that other people know what it's like to get into that business? So I think there's some opportunities for partnership on that.
Terry, that point that Dan and Brittany raised is also one of the recommendations that is included in Lane County's Affordable Housing Action Plan. The support for grassroots development, incremental development, assistance, and basically building that local capacity at all scales, from what Dan was describing to, well, could be anywhere, right? You could do, once you've built a unit of housing, you might consider doing it again. But at least if we could capture some of that available land, that could make a big difference.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, one more plug for the survey, the more the merrier. The numbers have been awesome, especially because we're in a pandemic, and this project's timeline is really fast. And to Dan's point, just about this conversation, it's a privilege to hear from you all and to work with you all. It's clear you care about the community, and truly one of the best part of my job. So thank you for being here tonight. And if you have any other questions, please contact me and Terry. We are always here to talk to you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Good work, Sophie, Terry, and Julie.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
good night.